US, of course, where women have had access to education and to some of those things, but continue to have to still do the bulk of the work, and of course are treated quite shabbily. This is further interpreted by the fact that across the world, 50% of people say men make better political leaders, and 40% say men make better business executives. So I guess we need to actually push more issues with women. We need to get women recognising that they or people like them can really do anything they want. And of course, one of the reasons for this limiting equality is the whole question around social norms. Ambivalence about women working outside the home, about notions about reputation and decorum, you know, mixing with men. And while we tend to think of that as not happening in OECD countries, people would recognise that the Vice President of the United States of America is a man who has such views that he will not eat out with any other women The only woman he will mix with and eat with is his wife. So these kind of views about reputation and decorum can be very entrenched, or can be taken up by particularly religious views and so on across our community. We also know the norms in relation to domestic work, that it's what's women's work, what women should be doing. And even in a country like Australia, we see women doing 8.5 hours of work where men do 3.5. So that's still a practice and a norm that limits women's ability to enter the job market in any equal kind of way. The other norms that are particularly, I think, important are around adolescent marriage and childbearing, because we know, of course, that early marriage not only can ruin young women's health with early childbearing, but it also limits their educational and economic opportunities. And again, can I point to regional Queensland, which has one of the highest numbers of teenage mothers in Australia, in particular in remote parts of Queensland. The latest figures there suggest that young women 15 to 19 years of age, over 1.3% of them are mothers. So, which I think is a very frightening figure, and it behoves us to keep working on that. Of course, at the other end of this whole question of social norms and power relations are issues around the question of sexual violence and what actually happens in the workplace. For some people in particular countries, it may be the agricultural workers and others, but of course, within the Australian context, we know the statistics here for domestic violence are terrifying. And they're born out of the notion of what it is to be a man, what it is to be in a relationship, questions about coercive control, and in particular the role of women. So this is, I think, this is one of the social norms that within Australia we really need to tackle. Our statistics are horrifying. To think that one woman a week is murdered by her current or former partner is just terrifying. Young women from the age of 15 to think that 1 in 3 is experiencing physical violence is shocking. I won't go through all of these, but I do think we actually understand that this whole question about domestic violence and domestic violence statistics within the Australian context is very seriously tied to notions of social norms and the way in which power relations are established or portrayed within the media and have been in society. Along with these, of course, are the notions of stereotypes, which are generalisations about the attributes of men and women that are shared in the society. So that traditionally, and in fact, we would say played out even in the Australian context, we've seen women take care while we allow men to take charge. And I think some of this can be very frightening. In this context, this reinforces gendered identities. It reinforces the notion of women at home doing the job. It constrains women's behaviours because they can't go out or they can't go to work or whatever. And also expectations of what it is to be a woman. It is to be a partner, or it is to be the lesser, or it is to be coerced by somebody who believes that their masculinity should be portrayed in controlling behaviour. So those kind of attributes are the kind of things that we see being constantly reinforced. If we look at Australia in particular, if we look to a woman's trajectory in Australia, we can see that from early childhood right through to retirement, there are very specific stereotypes and norms played out. So that within early childhood, we see gendered play space, we see gendered behaviour. Boys will be boys, let them push, shove. We've seen all of that. The notion of gendering appearance, dressing up little girls, dressing up little boys, and gendered toys. It's very early entrenched, and it's really something that we need to start thinking seriously about. At school, we know that young women stop studying maths and science, they stop playing sport, they spend 3 hours a day on social media, they experience violence, and they often have serious mental health issues. So somehow or other, conforming to this stereotype, conforming to the norms around young girls' behaviour, we are seeing this act out with some very serious consequences. Of course, within employment, once women get to employment, we see the gender pay gap, we understand the motherhood penalty, the lower award wages, the underpaid industries which are female dominated, and of course sexual harassment in the workplace. And we've seen some fairly serious cases of that in more recent times, where young women have attempted to take some very powerful men on, and most of it has ended, while the men have gone back to their high-powered jobs, the young women have found themselves unemployed forever. We also know that women do basically 80% of domestic labour, so all of which is uncounted, and of course single mothers are doubly penalised. And at the end of this, if you've started poor, you're sure as heck going to end poor. We know women over 66 now rely on the pension much more so because they have less superannuation. One of the reasons for that is that because women largely work part-time, many women work part-time, they find them superannuation only is paid after women reach $450 a month. And we know employers are keeping women under that amount so they don't have to pay superannuation. So women may do 1, 2 or 3 jobs but end up with no superannuation at all. And of course, that all leads to housing stress. So all of these are interrelated. So what then do women do when they go into fields of study? And they take up because they've decided to drop maths and science because of peer pressure and social norms and so on, they take up areas in education, health, society and creative arts, where they form somewhere between 60 to 70. In education, of course, women are about 74% of students. In some of the more mixed areas of agriculture and natural science and management and commerce, or in the business schools, they're roughly half and half. And then, of course, particularly frightening, I think, are the new technologies, ICT, some of the STEM information technologies and so on, where they're around the 17, 16, 15%. And why do we need to be worried about that? We need to be worried about that because of the changing nature in the workforce, and where we sit as Australia in relation to some of the other countries. In particular, if we look at the United Kingdom and the OECD, and Australia generally seems to have considerably more women in clerical support. It has more women in a range of other things, whereas women have lessened their grip in some parts, except in agriculture and forestry. In the OECD, women are very well represented there, where they're not here in Australia. So I think that also gives us an interesting snapshot of where Australia sits in relation to the role of women and women's access to employment, and as compared to some of our, people would say, some of our more culturally similar, perhaps, neighbours in terms of the UK and so on. We know that Australia's workforce is one of the most gendered in the world, where we have very large numbers of people there. We know that women are in what has become known as traditionally female-dominated industries, healthcare, education, and so on. Some male-dominated industries have reported a decline in female representation, which is what I pointed out, as some of them have become more dependent on robots and so on. We've seen females less there. And we know even in female-dominated industries that men are dominating the leadership positions. One of the more frightening things I think we know too is that average remuneration in female-dominated organisations is lower than male-dominated organisations. In other words, women's work is less valued than men's. And we also know that there is some, in terms of employment conditions, that women-dominated industries have more part-time employees rather than the full-time employees that men-dominated industries. And some would say, well, male-dominated industries are there, women have family and caring duties, so they can only work part-time. And this now has become the practice and a barrier for women to be entering into into higher paid and more long-term workforce. The other, I think, issues in terms of gender equality, in terms of entering the workforce and lessening the pay gender gap have been what have traditionally been known as patterns of exclusion. So women have traditionally been excluded from all sorts of places, building sites, particular work and so on, and of course even within households where people, male and female work is separated and women are excluded from doing some jobs because they're not seen as doing so. And I think this is particularly where I would recommend that women, young women, and particularly mothers can exert some influence on this. You know, that boys will be boys, boys don't have to set the table, they don't have to hang the washing out. Some of those other practices that have been around for quite a long time and that don't seem, while there are exceptions to the rule, we haven't actually made huge leap forwards, if the figures and the stats tell us, about the role of men and the men's work within the household. And I think that's a really important issue, and it has a flow-on effect then onto occupational choices. And these, of course, I think are really where we need to be looking, and looking with some concern, because these jobs at risk have been identified by Deloitte's, PwC, and a whole range of other people in terms of where automation is going to go. And if you look at them, quite a few of them, almost all of them, work that women do at the moment. You know, receptionists, sales, personal assistants, secretaries, general office work, cashiers, and even in accounting, where women certainly have made inroads into that field. And of course, food preparation. Although we have male celebrity chefs, where most of the food preparation in our community is done by women. So I guess if we're looking at these kind of jobs, we have to say that somehow we have to intervene for those young women entering high school and stop them from stopping their maths and STEM. The jobs least at risk, of course, fortunately, are also women's work, largely women's work, with teachers and childcarers and so on. But ICT, of course, and we know that women are very small in numbers there. Medical practitioners, women are now 50% of GPs, but they're not. But they're having trouble getting into the colleges to specialise. So that's also an area where we need to go. If we look at our fastest growing jobs, 75% of new jobs require STEM skills. That's critical thinking, problem solving, and analytic capabilities, curiosity, and imagination. So we need to get our young women into them. And if we're looking at what is happening around the world, we can see Australia as seriously being left behind. If we look, Germany, of course, has embraced technology and research, its curiosity, and it's involving itself in research and development. For every 1,000 researchers in Germany, they produce 53 patents a year. Even the US can't match that. We know in Sweden, 90% of Swedish students attend highly digitalised schools, and each year thousands of teachers attend STEM focus. What does Australia do? Very ad hoc, a bit here and a bit there. We've got the paltry sum of $15 million over 5 years for all the teachers in Australia, or for those lucky enough to actually, you know, get some contact with STEM and to work with STEM professionals. We actually need a systemic approach to this, to actually encourage, ensure, and to upskill people. And, you know, a few dollars here and a few dollars there, I mean, that's really just almost wasting the money there is, because it's not enough to do anything properly with. Now, norms can change, and economic development has found to be one of the big changes for changing norms. Economic empowerment programs, again, it's education, but it needs to be done in a systemic kind of way. Technology is changing the way in which people interact and relate and so on, but it's also reinforced some of the terrible, you know, kind of sexual gendering appearance and some of that trolling and some of those other things. We also need leadership from our political, legal and institutional environments. And if we look at the latest budget, in which it was initially agreed that women had suffered most during the COVID, most of the stimulus packages are in male-dominated industries. So construction, while we'd hope to have more women there, you know, right, the spin-off from them is very small. So all of this is happening in an environment where at the best we can suggest is that people are negligent, don't care, or simply don't want to do anything. So we need to keep working on these norms to make really big changes. And policy changes, of course, will not work if there is no consideration of the role of deeper rooted norms and practices. So we need to spend quite some time on looking at these norms, particularly in early childhood. And of course, that's been one of the big issues here again in Australia, this lack of a universal childcare, and it's not seen as something which would encourage and assist in not just women getting back to work, but the education of children, of early intervention in a whole range of things. It's an integral part of our society. And we've seen while it was here for a moment, now it's gone. And that is one of the really big issues around women re-entering the workforce, about early intervention for young children and so on. We've seen some changes internationally with legislated candidature for women taking the opportunities in political life and hoping to make some changes in Australia. The Labor Party has been very active through Emily's list and through its quota system in getting women into Parliament, where we now see most Labor representation is half and half. On the Conservative side of politics, it's been much slower and much more difficult, and that's partly an entrenched view. My earlier research suggested that most of those Conservative men had a very strong view about the role of women and where they should be, and it certainly wasn't in the Houses of Parliament. So I guess that's a norm that really needs to need to keep working on. Other issues I think are around accessibility to sexual education, to reproductive health, to family planning, and all those issues. And in Queensland, that can be particularly difficult in rural and regional Queensland. So we need to keep, I think, working and pushing towards some of those changes, that these services need to be available. They need to be available for all, and that as a society we're all enriched by them. And so it's very concerning when we look at the election in the United States of America to see, you know, that we may be rolling the clock back 50 or 70 years with the High Court and Roe versus Wade. So that's, I think, a very important issue for us. We've seen some countries where STEM policies are actually integrated right across the nation, largely in the South Americas. So I'm sure that Australia could somehow match some of those. But the ad hoc policy changes are in fact not worthwhile. They're not valuable as such. If we want to make serious change, we need to have a national plan, a national scheme. We need to attack some of these norms which are in fact holding us back. So where do we go from here? Well, I think we need to call out sexist behaviours and practices. We still see within the Australian context particularly, you know, the boys will be boys, you know, the footballers are, well, you know, they're footballers and they can do what they like. That's not, you know, not taken as this is actually criminal behaviour and needs to be addressed. We need to recognise the barriers for change, that there are some things that the government does need to do, that to legislate to change, that we need to be there. We need to be able to count. In other words, that we need our gendered statistics, because as they say, if it's not counted, it doesn't matter. And I guess that is particularly important. As you know, some of you know, I work on the gender lens on the budget, because since 2013, the Australian government no longer, with Tony Abbott, did away with the impact of the budget on women. So hence, the National Foundation for Australian Women continues to volunteer to do that. And we do that because we believe it's important to have the research to back us in terms of making legislative change which will empower and enhance women's lives. I think the role of universal childcare, I think, is well documented and well researched, and is important in the whole question of pay equity, women working and enhancing not just their lives but the lives of the community. We need to somehow interact with young women to ensure that they persist in schools in the STEM. It's too late to have programs for entry to university because they haven't done the maths or the science further back. So I guess that's something that we need to keep doing, early intervention. Of course, we know the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1966 was awarded to an economist who showed that early intervention for young children, for every dollar spent, could save anything from $17 to $22, you know, across the first 20 years. So I think we've known early intervention for a very long time, can address some of these issues, and that's what we need to do. And I guess we also need to acknowledge that sometimes change doesn't happen and that we need to legislate for it. The Sex Discrimination Act in 1984 was a milestone, and I think we're ripe for some big changes now, so that if we are to move towards a more equal society in which women's work, women's recognition of their skills and talents enrich not just them, but enrich our whole community, then we need to start making some serious changes, early intervention, some legislative changes, and ask women to call out what they see as very bad sexist behaviour. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. That was a fantastic talk covering such huge amount of ground.